If you're looking at buying a brand new Buick in the United States specifically, you better like SUVs and crossovers. Now, market data says that you do, obviously. That's why Buick has opted to get rid of all of its cars and station wagons and focus solely on SUVs and crossovers. So today we're taking a look at their cheapest entry into the brand with this, the 2021 Buick Encore GX, and its $24,200 base price. Now I'm going to show you around this little crossover. We're going to go over everything that I think that makes this a good, affordable daily driver, and then we're going to take it out for a drive and talk about how it performs on the road. But before we do any of that, I want to make sure you guys like this video and subscribe to the channel because it helps us out a ton. So I figured we could start with the Encore GX's front end because there's a lot going on here. And let's start with these wheels, which are in fact an optional extra. They're 18 inches, but the fact that they're not a 19 or a 20 inch means you're not giving up a lot in terms of overall ride quality. But in terms of aesthetics, I think they're kind of nice. They have a little chrome touch on them, and they kind of fit well with the overall rest of the design. Now, looking at the front end specifically, you're gonna find a large gloss black front grille. There's a lot of little design elements and touches going on in the front end, but I think they work well together to give this crossover a sharp look. So when looking at the GX, just because it is a crossover just like the rest of Buick's lineup, it doesn't mean that they share any major components. That's because the GX gets its own unique chassis, also unique engines. We'll touch on that in a second. But for the most part, this crossover is 1.3 inches wider and about 3 inches longer than the standard model. Now, that is not to say that this is a big crossover or a big little offering by any means. It's very, very small. Now, the added benefit of that is that it's very easy to maneuver, very easy to park, and in city driving scenarios like here in Miami, it's very, very easy to maneuver, even in sort of traffic scenarios. And I think personally, the fact that you get a lot of styling elements in the front, but as we move down the side, the sort of design in this area here is actually fairly simple. You get one major design element in the doors, a bit of chrome throughout to kind of spice things up a little bit, but it's not too over-styled. And I think simple design in sort of smaller vehicles, I think it's great. I think it helps them age perhaps a little slower. Now, while looking towards the rear end of the Encore GX, you're gonna notice that the styling gets a little bit sharper. Again, in this sort of middle area, it kind of dulls out a little bit, but we have a strong design line that comes from the rear door all the way across the rear quarter and into the tail light. And I think what that does, it makes a nice smooth transition from the door all the way to the rear end, and kind of everything matches up quite nicely. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that even though this is a small crossover, you're still getting 50 cubic inches of space, so there is enough, even if you are, let's say, a small family that wants a small sort of runaround kind of vehicle, there's a surprising amount of space in the rear end. Now, speaking of the rear end, we have these nice and large pronounced taillights. Again, nothing too over styled, nothing too over the top, but I think overall that'll help the GX age particularly well. I think the way that the sort of the rear end and the side and the front are so cohesive, it makes this one of the better looking little crossovers. Now, you might see based on the roof line, I'm not particularly super tall, about 5 feet 10 inches, and I can see well over the little Encore because the roof, you're gonna notice, it really does swoop down from the front down here to the little hatch. Now, while this might be one of the more affordable crossover entries in the market, you still get your proximity sensors down here, and more importantly, you get an automatic tailgate. Again, not the biggest in the world, but you do get a decent amount of space. Now, additionally, you can fold the second row and get even more space if you need to put longer items in here. But even with the seats up, again, there's a considerable amount of space here, and you see this little plastic, and that's sort of to hide, it's a little privacy, little shield for when you park in parking lots so people don't see into your trunk, but you can remove that if you want extra space. So in terms of engine options, you have just two for the Encore GX, and they're both 3-cylinder turbocharged engines. Now, the standard one is a 1.2 liter engine, makes about 130 horsepower, 160 pounds-feet of torque, but this particular tester has the larger 1.3 liter engine, which gives you 155 horsepower and 170-ish pounds-feet of torque. Now, all of that power gets channeled to the front wheels exclusively via a CVT. Now, On the road, we'll discuss what that CVT, how it performs in the real world, but again, it's your only transmission option. And I think it's worth pointing out the fact that this GX model does not share any powertrain options with the standard Encore, which is a little bit smaller. You can get a 4-cylinder in that one, but in the Encore GX, the only option you get is a turbocharged 3-cylinder. Now, if this lineup seems a little bit familiar, that's because this overall platform and engine options are shared with the Chevy Trailblazer, which is also in this sort of same price category. But of the two, this is the more sort of luxury-oriented one. And for the most part, the benefit of having the smaller engines, you do get a bit of extra fuel efficiency. This one is rated at 30 mpg in the city and 32 mpg on the highway. For the most part, when we've been driving this over the last week or so, I've averaged about 29.1 miles to the gallon. So now that we're behind the wheel of the 2021 Buick Encore GX, I think it's important that we start talking about its name, because given Buick's current lineup in the US market, the GX might be a little bit confusing. That's because Buick also sells the standard Encore. And in fact, both of these little crossovers fight in a very, very similar segment. In fact, there's only a couple $100 separating the base price of the Encore and the Encore GX. Now, for the most part, I'm not the biggest fan of CVTs in cars. I feel like sometimes they're a little bit noisy and they don't make the best use of the car's available power. But in the Encore GX, it's not as inconvenient or as annoying as most CVTs are. Even when you get in the higher RPM range, the Encore GX never gets a little too noisy, and it never allows a lot of that noise to permeate into the cabin, which again is very important if you're driving this on a daily basis. As the GX's power figures might suggest, this car has significantly more torque than horsepower. Now, the added benefit of that torque is that it does come in relatively down low in the RPM range. So in traffic driving scenarios, the GX, it's not fast, but it's reasonably quick getting off the line. And also in sort of traffic driving scenarios, it allows you to sort of exploit little gaps and doesn't feel too underpowered. Now, I'm not saying that this SUV, this little crossover, wouldn't be better with an additional 30 or something horsepower, because it really, really would. But for the most part, if you're driving in city environments, you're not going to notice the low power output. However, on the highway, if you're going to do a little bit of overtaking, you are going to really wish you had an extra maybe 30 or so horsepower under the hood, because it would make a massive difference. So now, looking at the cabin itself, you're going to notice a couple of things, namely that there's a lot of plastic in here, and typically that is a really sore point for me in terms of brand new cars, but Buick has gone a long way to sort of disguise a lot of the little plastic elements in here to try to sort of dress them up a little bit. For example, on the door you have a nice little soft touch material, so the same all here. Now this here, again, it is like that sort of plasticky, but it is soft touch and it is meant to look a little like leather. I'm not entirely convinced that it really does pull off a leather-like look. I feel like maybe if they had taken some plastic trim and really given it a unique design, it would have been probably a better exercise than trying to make it look more leather-like. But I can see that Buick is trying to give you a more sort of luxury-oriented crossover here, so I can see why they would want to go for that leather look. But again, soft touch up here. For the most part, it's surprisingly nice. I'm actually quite impressed with what you can get given the price point, given how low the sort of base entry-level price point is for this little crossover. However, if I had to pick a personal favorite thing about the interior, it would be this screen, and namely it's the infotainment system that lives within the screen. Now, like any other modern crossover, we get Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, all of that good stuff. And in this particular car, you can get it whether it's plugged in or you can do it wirelessly. One of the big benefits of this system is the addition of the cameras, which you can actuate when you're parking, which makes this little SUV very, very maneuverable. On the road itself, steering completely dead. There's no feeling coming from it. There's obviously, this isn't designed to be a sporty crossover, but again, feeling the steering is completely dead. For the most part on the highway, the engine is quite quiet, which is nice. Suspension, fairly compliant. I've driven some luxury vehicles that are far more expensive than this Encore and then ride a little stiffer. But again, it's nicely dampened, and part of what I like is that not only is the suspension nicely dampened, but there isn't a whole lot of road noise that kind of comes in here. Again, you do get a lot of sort of wind noise at speed, but in terms of overall road noise, even with the like really bad roads in Miami, it's not totally unreasonable. In terms of interior ergonomics, I like the softness of these seats, and in fact, they're actually quite adjustable. I have a good amount of lower back support. For the most part, they look quite nice. They have a nice little pattern design, so Buick didn't opt to just give it like a solid leatherette kind of texture. They really do look quite nice. They have some nice stitching on them as well. So I think at this point it's important that we pivot to talk about price, because this GX model as it sits is a bit on the expensive side. For the most part, the GX starts at $24,200 in the US. Now the regular Encore is a few $100s more, but it also falls within that $24,000 range. But remember that the standard Encore is slightly smaller than the GX. But our particular tester has an as-tested price of $35,000. That means we're talking about in upgrades, whether it be powertrain or interior features, we're talking about $10,000 over that standard price. So there we have it, the 2021 Buick Encore GX. Now, as far as little crossovers go, this is probably one of the better looking ones. In fact, in comparison with the standard Encore, I think this one is the one I would pick based on aesthetics alone. Now, as we discussed earlier, you don't get a ton of power under the hood, and that's just a consequence of having a smaller turbocharged 3-cylinder engine. But I think for me overall, in order to avoid getting too crazy with options and really pushing that price really high up, what I would do is get the biggest engine option you can, get the tech features inside that you need, but don't go crazy with some of the extras like the panoramic roof. That should keep your price relatively low. And in terms of sort of budget-oriented crossovers, with a nicely optioned one that meets your daily needs, this would be an excellent daily driver. Again, suspension is quite soft, sound deadening is good, the seats might be a little on the firm side, but overall, as a daily driver, this Buick Encore GX has very few flaws. And for the most part, I've enjoyed driving it. And so with that, I want to thank you guys all so much for watching. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more, and I'll see you again really soon.